to the already existing social nexus, right? That's really what's at stake. I apologize if that's a little complex, but that's 100% what's going on right now. That's undeniable. Underneath the image, middle of page 8, all institutions are social institutions. All institutions are social institutions. Political, governance, economic, academic, social services. These institutions are social institutions, right? Thus, all institutions are subject to change because our society is subject to change. As we said, with respect to, and Foucault says it, one force relation is dissolved, right, because of power. And the second it's dissolved, a new force relation occurs in its place. Power populates and depopulates. Interpret that how you will, right? Power populates and depopulates. Power transforms and is transformed by. So we are looking at a fluid, dynamic process. It's not a stagnant, repetitive process. But what we end up recognizing, if you're really good at what you do, is the regularity with which this process unfolds, right? There's no predicting, per se, how power will manifest, but we can make a suggestion that, the Occupy movement is attempting to establish itself. I'll explain more what a force relation is in a bit. Itself as a force relation, and I recognize, and I hope that if I'm successful in teaching you, you'll recognize that there are obligations. I don't mean in the moral sense. There are moral obligations, but there are obligations and there are requirements that are needed to establish oneself. You don't just pop up on the scene and say, hey, we're the new social movement, take us seriously. Right? That's not how it works. It's far more complicated than that. It has to be legitimate. It has to be recognized and sort of endorsed by the people. And we'll talk about, in a second, this process of endorsement in a bit. So, however, a fundamental change in the social institution transforms the nexus. Right? A change in the institution transforms the nexus, the web of societal force relations between these institutions. Thus, since power exists as a, quote, and this is a quote now from Foucault, multiplicity of force relations, immanent in the sphere in which they operate, and which constitutes their organization. It just happens to be organized like that. It could be organized in a different organization. It could be, as I showed you before, it can be organized in any number of ways, in an infinite number of ways. The attempt to transform the societal force relations is an attempt to transform the nature of power. Right? That's my point. Right? My point is to demonstrate Foucault's extremely abstracted concept, which I think is just super profound, and I've spent years reading Foucault and Nietzsche, because Foucault and Nietzsche sort of yield the best understanding of power, though they differ in certain parts. The attempt to understand, the attempt to transform the societal force relation is an attempt to transform the nature of power. Power is transformed insofar as this abstract concept of force relation is transformed. Insofar as this force relation is transformed, well, power is not, there is no, I'm not talking about power in some sort of abstracted, anthropomorphized sense. The real fact is that power is perpetually in a state of flux. And whether or not the social movement, whether or not Occupy is on the playing field, to speak, is, just whether or not Occupy is, whether or not it exists or it doesn't, is irrelevant to a discourse on power. It only becomes relevant, and now I'm getting deep, and I hope I'm not getting too deep. I don't want to be too out there. The Occupy movement only becomes relevant when we recognize Not that it exists. No one cares that I don't care that, and you shouldn't care that the Occupy movement exists. So what? It exists. It's not about the fact that it exists. It's what is the significance of its existence? What new relationships will this movement have to the existing social fabric? How will it transform this social fabric? And what is the direction of the Occupy movement within the nature of this existing discussion on force? Right? That's what's important. These are not easy questions to answer. They're also not very hard to answer. Off the top of my mind, just because of all the sort of the slogan stuff. Okay, so the Occupy movement is against corporate greed. Human needs, not corporate greed. It will introduce itself into the social fabric and transform the way in which those who are in positions of power to make decisions recognize human needs when they go to the bargaining table in some sort of John Rawlsian veil of ignorance sense, right? I apologize if that came out too hard and too quick, because a lot of you might not understand that. Basically, all that means is we want nothing more, and I'm sure there's much more that's wanted, but just as an example of this, the force relationship, societal fabric will transform for the better, hypothetically speaking, if it's the case that the Occupy movement is successful in a Rawlsian sense, taking our representatives, and when they go to the pinnacle of their power, which is exercising legislation, debating what they're going to do with the rest of the country, to think, yes, we have corporate concerns here, we have human needs concerns here, the people are definitely speaking, I'm going to take the people's consideration at face value. I'm going to take it to heart when I go to the decision table, and now I'm going to be motivated by the needs of the people. If that happens, this is sort of a very tacit, very sort of generalized account of Rawls's veil of ignorance, make a decision such that the decision is to the advantage of the least advantage. But if that happens, then when they walk away from the decision table, right, when those in different loci of power walk away from the decision table, you see how it's connected, right? There's a rippling effect, right? There's an immediate rippling effect. And then we can connect the decision and a transformation in the social fabric to the occurrence of this new force relation in the social fabric. So that all of this is connected, which will transform academia, which will transform science, which will transform economics, and blah, 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 blah. I mean, really difficult stuff to try and visualize, even more difficult stuff to try to prepare for a lecture. But I hope I'm making sense. All right, next point. Movement-specific note. Organizers and protesters should, number 3 pertains to the first part on page 7. 3 was, as strategies in which, this is a direct quote from Foucault, as the strategies in which they take effect, the general design or institutional crystallization is ... So we're looking at strategies in 3, right? So the movement-specific note, you, organizer of various events, you, protesters interested in going to Occupy events, organizers and protesters should strategically conceptualize how the occupation movement, as fully realized, not just Occupy Fort Lauderdale, Occupy Miami, Occupy San Diego, Occupy Phoenix, Occupy DC, Occupy the world, Occupy whatever, right? Not particular nodes of occupation, but the occupation movement as fully realized in its end state, whatever that might be, and I really don't know what that is. But organizers and protesters should, 3, strategically conceptualize how the occupation movement as fully realized will fit into the overall structure of these societal force relations, SFRs, right? How will it fit into societal force relations? And I just talked about like an example of how it might be introduced into these various force relations. Will it become part of Will it become part of an existing societal force relation? So, for example, will the Occupy movement become an economic movement? since it has almost widely been thought of as